Whether you're a new or veteran hockey card collector, the NHL Draft is always one of the most exciting times of the year because it is where you find out what top rookie your team is going to land that you'll be able to collect in the upcoming seasons. And while the 2023 NHL Draft was lackluster from a trade standpoint, it was packed full of impact players that'll be making their NHL debuts over the upcoming seasons. So let's go over some of those players, when you can expect to find their rookie cards, and yeah, just the general timeline for NHL rookies from an NHL entry draft. As a quick refresher, just before we start naming names and dropping expected timelines for players, in order for a player to receive a rookie card in the NHL, they first have to play in an NHL regular season or playoff game. We made a video breaking that down. There will be a link to it in the top right corner of the screen, as well as in the description below if you want to check that out. Another very important thing to keep in mind throughout the duration of this video is that when a player makes their NHL debut will affect when they receive their rookie card. For example, just based off the 2022-23 Upper Deck Young Gun crop, any player that made their debut in the new year of 2022 was held back for Series 1 in 2022-23. And then any player that made their debut in October of 2022 was then used for Series 2 that came out in March. And then any player between kind of the end of October and the start of the new year, so between like November 1st and January 1st, were then used in extended series. It's a little bit complex, but essentially that's how it works out. Those dates kind of change here and there, but that's how it's been the past couple of years. So whenever you hear us reference a player and their expected debut date, those are kind of the ones that you need to remember. And then any player that makes their debut past January 1st, 2024 will probably be held back for Series 1 in 24-25. But again, that could change just depending on lead times and print demands for the products. Now let's get into the players, and let's start with the two givens, Connor Bedard and Adam Fantilli. Connor Bedard is pretty much set in stone to make his NHL debut when Chicago faces off against Pittsburgh when the puck drops to start the NHL season, and so that means he'll probably have his Young Gun in 2023-24 Upper Deck Series 2. We made an entire video on Connor Bedard himself, so feel free to check that one out. Again, link on the screen now or in the description below later. In terms of Adam Fantilli, he was a bit of a different case and wasn't a 100% guarantee, but given that he was drafted out of the NCAA and has already signed his entry-level contract, it's pretty much certain he's going to make his debut in October. Assuming both Bedard and Fantilli play in October, they'll likely get their Young Guns in 2023-24 Upper Deck Series 2, although there is a chance Upper Deck holds back Fantilli for extended series. However, I think just given their print timelines, he'll probably be in Series 2, and that could be one of the most stacked rookie crops we have ever seen. So be sure to subscribe, because when we find out more about that product and the checklist, we're definitely going to have a breakdown on that. Next up, we have three players that are maybe make their debut at the start of next season. They are Leo Carlsson of the Anaheim Ducks, Will Smith of the San Jose Sharks, and David Reinbacher of the Montreal Canadiens. In the case of Leo Carlsson and David Reinbacher, I think there's a decent chance both of them make their opening day rosters, just because they can play in either the AHL, the NHL, or they can go back to their men's league overseas. I think of the two, Leo Carlsson is the most likely to make the NHL to start the season, just based off of the team's needs in Anaheim, his draft position, and just how well he's done against the men in the Pro League. However, the same also applies to David Reinbacher, and I mean, it's Montreal, they might give him a chance, so if they both make their debuts in early October, they could potentially be in 2023-24 Upper Deck Series 2 alongside Fantilli and Bedard, and yeah, that would be a pretty insane product. However, one very important thing to note is that they could hold one or two of them back for extended series, just to kind of balance out the Young Gun crop and give extended series a couple headliners. And then there's Will Smith. I think he does have the talent level to play in the NHL as early as October, which is kind of why I left him in this tier. However, I think it's more likely just given the San Jose Sharks team scenario, and probably just because it's more beneficial for him to return back to the NCAA for another year in college before signing his pro contract once the college season ends this year. So expect him to make his debut in about April of 2024, which would put him in line for a Young Gun in 2024-25 Upper Deck Series 1. From here on out, we're going to cover the players based off of what league they were drafted out of, just because it's easier to kind of group them together that way. I don't think it's likely that many other players will make their NHL debut to start this season, so we're looking at kind of end of season NHL debuts for players, which means pretty much everyone we mentioned from this point on, with a couple of exceptions, will probably either be 2024-25 Young Guns or maybe even 25-26. We're going to kick things off with Russian players because they are the most unique, and again, Matvei Michkov is one of the most hyped prospects just given his absurd talent level. Matvei Michkov will have a ton of hobby hype if he ever crosses the seas to the NHL. However, Russian players are a little bit different from every other player that is drafted because they typically have contracts in the KHL, and they normally don't come over to the NHL until those KHL contracts end. In the case of Michkov, his KHL contract is good through 2025-26, so it's likely we won't see him make his NHL debut until 2026-27, which means he'll probably be a 26-27 Series 1 or Series 2 Young Gun. Just kind of depends on the print timelines, and it's really hard to judge them. That's like 3 years down the road, so yeah, kind of just gotta wait and see on him. The good news for Arizona Coyotes fans is that both Dmitri Simashev and Daniil Boot's contracts end a year earlier, so they could make the jump as early as the 2025-26 NHL season, which would mean you'd see their Young Guns for probably 2025-26 Upper Deck Series 2, maybe Series 1 if the print timelines change, maybe Extended Series, who knows, but probably 2025-26 as long as they hit as prospects. And another thing that is worth mentioning here is that at any point, a player could be bought out of their KHL contract. However, that rarely happens right now. So generally, just the best rule of thumb is that once their KHL contract ends, they'll likely come over here unless they sign an extension. NCAA players are the easiest to tell of when they're going to make their NHL debut because there are typically two timelines that they do: the end of an NHL regular season or the start of an NHL regular season. And this is all due to how the NCAA operates as an amateur league. Again, like we've mentioned with previous players drafted out of the NCAA, the minute they sign their NHL entry-level contract, they can no longer return to the NCAA, which leaves them only a couple of options to play in, either the NHL, the AHL, or I guess overseas technically, but it's typically the NHL or AHL, and if they're a first-round draft pick, odds are, if they're signing at the end of the season, they're going straight to the NHL. And because they're making their debuts so late in the season, they're typically held over for the next year's Series 1. As an example, Leonard and Tom Willander, if they make their NHL debuts in March or April of next season, will probably be a 2024-25 Upper Deck Series 1 Young Gun. If players are drafted from other European leagues like the Swedish Hockey League or the Swiss National League, it can be a little bit tougher to predict when they're going to make their NHL debut because there are a variety of factors at play, including what their status is on their club team overseas, what their status would be on the AHL team, and what their status would be on the NHL team. It pretty much comes down to the player and how quickly they develop and what their role kind of is to determine whether or not they'll be making the jump to North America and to the NHL. Again, they are free to play in the AHL, unlike CHL and NCAA players, so if a team wants a more hands-on development approach, they could choose to bring them overseas. However, if they're going to play top minutes for their Swedish Hockey League team like Axel Sandin Pellikka could be, then the team might just want to leave them over there because they're going to develop a lot of good pro skills playing overseas. Typically though, based off recent drafts, it takes between 1 to 3 years for mid to late first round picks to make their NHL debut. Generally, it's in that 1 to 2 year range, kind of once their European League season ends, they'll kind of make the jump across like Marco Kasper did this year. But again, it varies just a lot depending on how much the player develops over the course of a season. Finally, we end up with players who are drafted out of the CHL, such as Nate Danielson and Zach Benson. For these players, their options are extremely limited as they can either play in the NHL or CHL due to how the NHL-CHL transfer agreement works. Additionally, once they get sent down from the NHL to the CHL, they can no longer get recalled to the NHL unless it's under emergency conditions, such as what happened with Owen Beck and the Montreal Canadiens last year. That NHL-CHL transfer agreement is sometimes why you see CHL prospects start the year with an NHL team, then get sent down around the 9-game mark. That 9-game mark is important because once a player plays 10 games in a season, their entry-level contract kicks in and it burns a year, which means they're a year closer to either restricted free agency and unrestricted free agency. So teams really don't want to do that because they want to try and take advantage of the cheap ELCs. For Nate Danielson, I expect him to either make his NHL debut for the start of the 2024-25 NHL season or for the 2025-26 NHL season, so probably either a 2024-25 Upper Deck Series 2 Young Gun or a 2025-26 Upper Deck Series 2 Young Gun. Then there's Zach Benson, and I think Zach Benson has a sneaky chance of getting a debut as early as this year, just given his outrageous skill set and how good he has been in the WHL over the past few seasons. I still can't believe he got drafted that late. So I think there's a possibility Buffalo gives him a look early on in this year and sends him back down just to build practice habits and get him under his strength and conditioning regimen and stuff like that. So maybe there's an outside chance you see him start the season this year, but at the very least, I expect him either later in this year once his WHL season is over, or maybe even as early as next season just to be in the NHL full time. Again, I don't know how he fell that late in the draft. He is such a good and dynamic player. One final general rule to mention is that the later a player gets picked in the NHL entry draft, the longer it takes them to reach the NHL and the less likely they are to make the NHL in general. While there are some exceptions to the rules like the 4th, 5th, and 6th round picks that make the jump as early as next season just due to them being a late bloomer, they are few and far between, but there's always a couple of surprises in every single draft, so we just kind of gotta wait and see. Anyways, hopefully you enjoyed today's video. If you learned something, feel free to leave a like. If you've got any questions, let us know in the comment section below, and we'll try to answer as many of them as possible. As always, have a good weekend, and I'll see you in the next video.